Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Amber Mace, and I am the Executive Director of the California Council on Science and Technology. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to another briefing in our series on carbon neutrality. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We were created at the request of the legislature to deliver content into you like this. And we partner with California's incredible network of academic and research institutions in order to pull in the knowledge that's created throughout the state to inform policymakers in the legislature, the executive branch, and the governor's office. And we do that through briefings like this, through peer-reviewed reports, through workshops, and through our CCST Science Fellows program. And today, as I mentioned, we're continuing a series related to carbon neutrality. And this is obviously a timely topic as it relates to this series of intersecting disasters we've been facing in the state. We've all been experiencing this. Some are climate related, like the mega fires. We also are experiencing this pandemic, and these have been tremendously disrupting the work and lives of all Californians. And so while these are very painful, they also present an opportunity for us to rethink and redesign the systems that are in place so that they can be more sustainable and more resilient. And this is only possible if we are sufficiently bold, creative, and forward-thinking. And so we are thinking about it through the science and technology lens, recognizing that science and technology is revolutionizing a whole range of sectors that can really heighten opportunities for social progress. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that they can also magnify existing social inequalities and present new risks to privacy, to public safety, and to national security. And so as part of our mission of connecting science and policy, we have launched a disaster resilience initiative. And this is a way for us, again, to make that connection between this knowledge that's created and to the policymakers who actually need this information in digestible, actionable, independent, useful forms that are timely. And so that's our focus. And so today, we're going to be talking about the technological pathways for carbon sequestration to help meet California's bold climate neutrality goals. And I'm really pleased that this conversation today follows on a conversation that was started in March by the Lawrence Livermore Lab Foundation when they convened a group of experts to reflect on the regional insights on community attitudes towards carbon capture and sequestration. This is a really lovely follow-on to that, as well as to some of our briefings in this series. All of those, our briefings are available on our website. So it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, David Stout. He is the supervisor in the Energy Efficiency Research Office in the Research and Development Division of the California Energy Commission. He has extensive expertise on pathways to achieve cost-effective decarbonization of California's industrial, agricultural, and water sectors. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn it over to you, Mr. Stout. Take it away.
Thank you. Hi, I'm the supervisor of California Energy Commission's Efficiency Research Office, leading the Industrial, Agriculture, and Water team, which focuses on cost-effective decarbonization of the industrial sector by increasing energy efficiency or through the substitution of electricity with substitution of natural gas with electricity or alternatives, as well as large-scale demonstrations of pre-commercial efficiency and industrial technologies. A little background on me: I've been at the CEC just under a year. Prior to the Energy Commission, I spent over 15 years working at a nonprofit research organization, SRI International, performing and managing contract scientific research, where I led a team of engineers performing chemical and biological process optimization and developing novel chemical hardware systems, primarily focusing on energy and energy storage, advanced materials and coatings, and chemical and drug discovery. One program that I led related to today's discussion, it involved the biological conversion of carbon dioxide and hydrogen into higher value products. Turning to the topic of today's panel, carbon capture and sequestration. Anthropogenic carbon emissions are a leading cause of climate change. California has set an ambitious goal of being carbon neutral by 2045. A combined approach of reducing carbon emissions and increasing carbon sequestration can help California reach its goals. CO2 can be sequestered either using natural pathways such as forests or working lands, or using technological pathways such as machines or industrial processes to capture and store the CO2, such as in saline formations or underground caverns. Today, I have 4 experts with me working to understand ways to utilize technological pathways to increase carbon sequestration in California to contribute to achieving our state's climate goals. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sally Benson, PhD, professor at Stanford University.
Hi, yeah, so would you like me to introduce myself briefly? Yeah, okay, sure. Hi, I'm Sally Benson. I'm a professor of energy resources engineering at Stanford University. My discipline is I am a hydrogeologist. So basically hydrogeologists are people who study how fluids move underground. And with regard to carbon capture and storage, specifically I study the fundamental processes involved in safely storing CO2 in deep geological formations. I also work on site selection and site characterization, injection design, risk assessment, and monitoring. I've been working on CCS since 1998, so I was one of the really early people engaged in this topic. And as a matter of fact, I published California's first assessment of the CO2 storage capacity back in about 2002. And at the time, I wasn't sure that CCS made any sense at all. But it was on the basis of that study in California that I became persuaded that CCS could play a big role in helping to reduce emissions, particularly reducing emissions from hard to decarbonize sectors like industry. So anyway, it's really great to be here. I look forward to a really terrific conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Benson. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Holly Buck, PhD, Assistant Professor at the University of Buffalo.
Hi, everyone. So my background is actually in rural sociology, and I've been researching community perceptions of decarbonization technologies, especially how do communities see carbon removal in their desired climate and energy future. And I've been doing research in the central United States. I work with partners in the European Union, but previously I was a research fellow at UCLA. I've done interviews with stakeholders in the Imperial Valley. And most recently, I've been working with a team at Lawrence Livermore National Labs to understand stakeholder and community perceptions in both the Delta and Kern County.
Thank you, Dr. Buck. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Preston Jordan, a geologist at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab.
Thank you very much, David. I'm happy to be here and be with the other panelists. Like Dr. Benson, and I guess this won't come as any surprise, I'm also a hydrogeologist and engineering geologist, and have studied many of the same aspects that she has. And it's no surprise because she actually got me into this field in 2006, since which I've been primarily researching carbon sequestration. I've also had a practice in researching other uses of the deep subsurface in relation to our energy systems. So I was one of the lead authors of the report for the state on hydraulic fracturing in California and the underground gas storage system in California. But for the purposes of today, my expertise is in the third box, if you look at the tech note, which is sequestration reservoirs. And to be clear, these aren't reservoirs on the surface like you might think of with water, but these are subsurface reservoirs, which is a term for porous rock. There was a mention of sequestration in caverns, and that is generally not anticipated. There is storage of natural gas in caverns in places on the Gulf Coast, but sequestration of CO2 is primarily envisioned to occur in porous rocks, which you can think of like a sponge. So I've done a lot of work in risk assessment, both on the looking at wells and looking at geologic leakage pathways. And I just look forward to talking and mostly to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan. And up next and final panelist today is Dr. Gaurav Sant from UCLA, professor there. You're muted.
All right, thanks very much, David. Hi, everyone. So I'm a professor of engineering at UCLA, where I have appointments in the departments of civil and environmental engineering and material science and engineering. And I also lead our Institute for Carbon Management. The general focus of our work is really directed towards developing the fundamental knowledge, the technologies, and first-of-kind industrial systems to be able to manage carbon dioxide. And we've really taken a focus in two directions. One of them is really looking at hard-to-abate sectors, things like the production of cement and steel as an example. And another direction, which is trying to really use natural systems, kind of like the world's oceans, to be able to manage carbon dioxide at scale. And the work generally starts off, as you might imagine, in a classic academic setting, but we try and sort of take this perspective that we want to be able to develop technological solutions which could achieve industrial scale. With that said, over to you, David.
Great, thank you. And we will now start off with the Q&A session. If you have any questions, please submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and they will end up being forwarded to me. But I'd first like to start off with a little bit more background on carbon capture sequestration, with the question of how can technological carbon sequestration pathways help California meet its climate goals. And I'd like to start off with Dr. Benson.
Okay, thanks very much. So let's put this into a little perspective. So today, California emits about 450 million tons of CO2 a year. And as we've heard, our goal is to completely eliminate these by mid-century, by 2045. And after that, we might also decide that we want to be scrubbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that we can get back on target to limit warming to, say, 1.5 degrees C. So we recently completed a big study, and I actually put a link to it in the chat if you're interested, looking in detail at CCS opportunities in California. We looked at all of the emission sources, existing emission sources, because we sort of had a short-term focus, like what could we do today if we started moving on this quickly. And we looked at all of the emission sources, and we focused on the ones that were big enough that would warrant installing carbon capture equipment and so forth, but that they were also big enough that they would qualify for some of the federal tax incentives that are available today for carbon capture and storage. So of that 450 million tons, we identified 60 million tons a year of CO2 that could be eliminated using CCS. Then that's about 15%. So maybe 15% doesn't sound so much, but actually it's bigger than all the heavy duty transport. It's bigger than the heating sector and so forth. So it is a really significant component. And most importantly, these are the emissions that are often called sort of hard to eliminate. So for example, in not electrifying transportation, that's going to be a really great way to eliminate a lot of tailpipe emissions as an example. And we know that we can put in a lot more PV and wind for electricity generation. So it's things that are outside of that bucket. And so when we looked across the state, we found that things like ethanol production, and there's not a lot of that, but that's sort of really low-hanging fruit for being able to capture and store those emissions. Hydrogen production, which is done extensively today and in the future, as we imagine thinking about hydrogen for heavy-duty transport, or thinking about hydrogen for decarbonizing activities that require very high-grade heat. That's important. Also things like cement manufacturing, where the CO2 emissions don't just come from the energy, but actually come from the process of converting the raw materials into the cement material. And then we've also identified that there are some of the natural gas combined cycle plants which may also benefit from CCS. And the value of those is that, you know, right now we're thinking so much about issues like resource adequacy and so forth. And it's very important to have some firm capacity, dispatchable capacity for clean power that can complement the solar energy and wind energy and so forth. So those are sort of very immediate things that could be done. But CCS can also play an important role in something we call carbon dioxide removal, or sometimes we call negative emissions technologies. And these are technologies that actually extract carbon dioxide from the air. You can think about sort of cleaning up the atmosphere and pumping the CO2 deep underground. And there are a number of technologies that can do that. One of them is bioenergy plus CCS, that you use basically biomass to produce heat or power. You capture those emissions, and because the CO2 actually was pulled from the atmosphere by the trees, that you can actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And similarly, there are other technological approaches like direct air capture that again use chemical scrubbers to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. There are also some emerging technologies like using particular types of minerals that if you put them in the atmosphere, they'll absorb the CO2. And then if you heat those minerals, they'll release the CO2, and you could put that underground. So lots of innovation in that space, really sort of the cutting technological edge of carbon capture. And the benefit of all these negative emissions technologies is they can be used to offset other difficult to eliminate emissions. So things like air travel. You know, we have a lot of emissions from air travel. Also, some forms of heavy duty transport are going to be difficult to decarbonize. And then we also have land use emissions that we also need to offset. So this is sort of the portfolio of things, some that could be done right now if we put our mind to it, and some that in the long run will create great benefits for decarbonizing the atmosphere. So I think I'll turn it back over to you, David.
Thank you. I see Mr. Jordan raising his hand. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just briefly, maybe to step back and frame it. There's a whole body of research that's been done on what role carbon sequestration can play. And I generally put these under the rubric of energy pathway research. So how do we get from where we are to an energy system, a society that doesn't emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? And in general, those studies seem to come to a consensus that there are pathways to do it without geologic carbon sequestration, but they cost something like 2 times as much to achieve. So it's a policy choice for society, whether it wants to use this technological approach or not. There are other options, but it comes down to a matter of cost, which is a social choice. I'll put a link to just one of these studies into the chat for those that are interested, but there are a number of other ones that are out there. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd like to go ahead and move on to a second question from what are some potential co-benefits of technological carbon sequestration pathways? What are some potential barriers to equitable access to co-benefits? And I'd like to direct this question to Dr. Buck.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm happy for it. And to be honest, I feel like this is an area where we need a lot more development in the policy space to sketch these out, because we know there are potential benefits both in terms of creating new permanent jobs, especially jobs in places where there's already been fossil fuel production. We need a just transition for those workers. Carbon sequestration and carbon removal jobs could be an option in those places. So that's one area of benefits. Another could be, community benefit funds or taxation programs that would fund different things, whether that's schools or infrastructure, similar to other kind of natural resource arrangements. But we haven't quite gotten to, in my view, to that point where we're having a detailed discussion about this. But I think there's a lot of opportunities, and the constraints on those being equitable. I mean, I'm more optimistic in California than in other places, frankly. And I think that this is one of those areas where California could really take the leadership in building on other legislation that includes environmental justice concerns. Somebody, just to wrap up, somebody asked the question about the current policy constraints. There's a great report, it's pretty brief, it's called Capturing Opportunity, Law and Policy Solutions to Accelerate Engineered Carbon Removal in California, out of Berkeley Law and the UCLA Law School. And it talks about some of those constraints with also an equity lens and what could be done. So, for example, using California's EJ screening tools to identify cumulative burdens, but also places where there might be opportunities.
Thank you. Next question we actually have from an audience member, Ilya Krupinich from the CEC. According to the recent report prepared by Stanford, it will take about 10 years for permitting of a carbon capture project. Can you elaborate what are the bottlenecks in the process and what kind of policy adjustments are necessary to address this issue in your opinion? And I'd like to give Dr. Sant an opportunity to respond to this if he would like, or I'll open it up to the panel.
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to take it, but Sally should weigh in for sure. The short answer really turns out to be, I think, we can look at permitting in general, and permitting for CCS is only one part of it. But generally, permitting is pretty slow because not only is, I think there's a couple of pieces. So I think number one, there's multiple agencies that are involved with permitting. So it's not like there's a single clearinghouse that you can go to and there's not a perfectly well-defined process. I think that's comment number one. Comment number two, I think there's lots of stakeholders that are involved, which I think also makes this very hard. And finally, I think we're still gathering information on really the way to do this. And because there isn't really a well laid out procedure, 10 years is definitely an estimate. Who knows, it could even be longer. That being the case, and I think especially if we keep this 2045 target in mind, 10 years is a long time before you can get clarity on whether you're going to build a project or not. And I think the other complexity, which I think leads into all of this, is beyond sort of just permitting for the basic project. We're missing infrastructure, right? We're missing pipelines, we're missing compression stations, which are eventually going to be needed to move carbon dioxide around. And that being the case, I think it's not sufficient to just look at sort of permitting that's needed for the baseline project itself. The question is, what's really the remaining ecosystem that's needed to support some of these projects at a sufficient enough scale that they make a difference? And I think that's something that needs to factor into our thinking as well when we think about permitting.
Yeah, so maybe I'll add a little to that. And I think we can divide this sort of into two different cases. In one case, imagine that you have an emissions facility and you're located right over a geologic reservoir where you could store the CO2. Probably the single biggest hurdle is that you need to get something called a Class 6 permit, which is a permit from the US EPA. And to date in this country, there have only been, I believe, maybe four issued, and only one of those is actually active. So the regulatory capacity to issue those permits is very, very small. So it should not take 6 years. This was the first one, took 6 years to get. It should not take that long. It doesn't need to take that long. Equivalent permitting and other activities is much faster. But it's not just that one permit then. There's about another 24 permits that you need to get. And as we heard, that right now that and the requirements for permitting are all there for good reason, right? They're all intended to be protective. But the challenge is it's with so many different agencies, and there's no sort of one go-to clearinghouse that can help navigate the pathway. So that's part of the reason why it's so slow for this. And honestly, like for project finance, this is just death to project finance, right? If you get your loans set up and you want to get ready to go, and the next thing you know, you're spending 5 to 10 years trying to get your permits, that's, wreaks havoc on your financial strategy. So the second case is the more complicated one that we've heard about needing pipelines and so forth. So say, for example, that you had a cluster of industrial facilities that weren't co-located. And in Southern California and Northern California, there are both clusters, in the LA area and the San Francisco Bay Area. Neither of those are optimally suited for CO2 storage. So what you would really like to do is you'd like to have a gathering system that would take all that CO2, efficiently gather it into then what could be like a large pipeline that could then transport that to a good location for storage. Getting pipelines built is incredibly difficult and time consuming. And so in our study, what we thought would be the best strategy is to look at existing rights of ways and use that sort of as a platform for developing these systems. But that could take even much longer even than the single project. So if we're going to rely on this technology, which I guess Preston said, well, there were alternatives. I'm not really sure that we can get to zero without this technology. But if we, if we want to, by a decade or now, be prepared to start gathering the CO2 from these hubs that are not co-located with storage, we need to get going right away. And this regulatory coordination could be really enabling to help us get going. And just to say one more little thing. So, in terms of the single project, co-located with a storage site, it would be fantastic to have a demonstration project where, we could, cooperate and collaborate to, understand what are all the bottlenecks in the permitting process, what are, how does this project work in practice in California so that regulators and the public and all could get comfortable and learn as we go. So thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a little history here might be instructive. So from about 2005 to 2015, the country was defined into 7 separate partnerships that were funded by the Department of Energy, a US agency, to pursue geologic carbon sequestration research. And the region that California was in was the only region that didn't put a single molecule of CO2 in the ground. All other 6 regions managed to do so as a part of research projects. And part of the barrier in California was just navigating the complex agency landscape. So failure is an option. That's California's demonstrated that. At the same time, California has the highest price on carbon emissions in the world now, in the form of the low carbon fuel standard market, which is not as well known as the cap and trade market. So the economic driver is there. California has led in really putting a substantial economic driver in place. But there are outstanding, pretty massive questions. For instance, it has not been legally defined who owns the pore space, who owns the hole in the rock. Is it the mineral rights owner? Is it the surface owner? And without a firm answer to that question, that makes it much more difficult for potential project operators to get the project going. There are some other issues, like California having been the 3rd largest producer of oil and gas for quite a long time, not currently, but for quite a long time. A lot of exploration came with that. So there's a large number of exploration borings that have been advanced. And those borings where they didn't encounter oil or gas generally were just left open without pipe in the deep subsurface. They were plugged in the shallower subsurface, but they were left open in the deep subsurface. And so that's a sort of large outstanding question in terms of how the regulatory community will approach those issues.
Thank you. I think we'll move on to the next question, headed in slightly different direction back towards technologies. This is from Katarina Robinson from Senator Skinner's office. She asks, which new green hydrogen technologies that are coming to market can result in no carbon emissions and no local air pollution emissions at the site the hydrogen is created? And I'll open that up to the panel if anyone wants to chime in first. And possibly maybe even discussion of blue hydrogen, since that's more applicable to carbon capture. So go ahead, Mr. Jordan.
Yeah, so there is a company, Clean Energy Systems, that is potentially pursuing projects that would produce hydrogen from biomass and then burn some of the other gases that come off in an electricity generator system in order to produce the power that allows generating the hydrogen from biomass, and the emissions from that would then be sequestered geologically. So that's one potential pathway, and one homegrown California company that is pursuing that. I'm sure the other panelists can speak to other ones, but that's one that I'm aware of.
I mean, there are certain, go ahead, yeah.
Fine, thanks, Sally. So maybe what the only comment I would make is that, there's essentially a variety of electrolysis solutions that can be used in principle to produce green hydrogen. I think one of the issues that you run into, and they don't have necessarily any I would say other disruptive emissions that are associated with them, but the challenge with thinking about green hydrogen is it requires green electricity. And while there is indeed an excess of green electricity, we have that excess only during portions of the day. So until we get to the point that the cost of electricity storage comes down significantly enough, I think there's going to be some serious challenges to really having hydrogen being produced 24 hours a day as well. This has implications because when you have facilities with a capacity factor of 30% as an example, because they run only when the sun shines or the wind blows, you've obviously got a large cost that you need to be able to accommodate. So I think technologically speaking, I think there is a line of sight towards green hydrogen, and there's a line of sight towards large amounts of green hydrogen. This is something that the Europeans are doing very aggressively with building these very large hydrogen hubs, which is happening in Germany, which is happening in the United Kingdom. But they are all really conditioned on availability of renewable energy to be able to power lots of the systems that will produce this hydrogen. I think when you look at hydrogen that you produce from natural gas, with steam methane reforming as an example, the challenge is what do you really do with the carbon dioxide that you produce? And if you can sequester it, now you've got a solution there. But otherwise, the challenge I think with green hydrogen is also related to cost. Hydrogen from steam methane reforming today costs maybe about a fifth or a sixth as much as green hydrogen, if not more. And I think the economics turn out to be a challenge as well. So it's not simply sufficient to have even renewable energy, because I think technologically there's a lot more work to be done to collapse the cost of green hydrogen to a point that is competitive with, as an example, gasoline, so to speak.
Yeah, just to sort of follow up on that. So currently it costs anywhere from, I don't know, $2 and $2.50 per kilogram to produce hydrogen with steam methane reforming plus carbon capture and storage, all in costs. The comparative costs for electrolysis with sort of typical electricity rates is in the sort of 8 cents a kilogram range. So if you wanted to get the cost of electrolysis produced hydrogen down to the cost for steam methane reforming plus CCS, you need to have about 1 cent a kilowatt hour electricity, which is far lower than California electricity prices today.
Thank you. For our next question, it comes from Nicholas Albiani. Is nuclear power a good option for the green energy availability issue? To expand on what where the past discussion was going. I'll open that up to any of the panelists.
Maybe I'll just pick up on the hydrogen question. And so one question is can you use nuclear power to make hydrogen with electrolysis? And certainly you can. I mean, in many ways, they would be really matched up well, because your electrolysis unit actually like to operate full time. That would be most economically efficient, and your nuclear power plants like to operate full time. So that would be a way to get your carbon, completely carbon and emission-free hydrogen. Going back to the question of, is nuclear a good way to get clean power? I mean, recent studies, we've just finished a large study with EDF and Clean Air Task Force and Princeton and Stanford and E3. And we were looking at the electricity system in California, and we had 3 completely different models, all very sophisticated, very high temporal resolution, high spatial resolution, and so forth, including all imports and outports. And we came to the conclusion that if you wanted to get carbon-free electricity, that it would cost about half as much if you have some form of clean, firm power, meaning something that you could turn on anytime you wanted, for as long as you wanted, and so forth. So, what are the technological options there? Well, nuclear power is one. Another one is, natural gas combined cycle plants plus carbon capture and storage. There's geothermal, of course, but is it going to be available at the scale? Right now, it doesn't appear that would be possible. So our estimates suggested you needed between like 15 and 30 gigawatts of clean, firm power in order to provide the reliability and cost effectiveness. So nuclear is an option. I know people have hugely varying views on the future of nuclear. The U.S. has really lost its expertise in that area. I mean, we operate a lot of plants, but we're only building two new nuclear plants in the U.S. But for the time being, the fleet that we do have is providing, emission-free power, which, in a world where we want to constrain emissions, I personally think that's very valuable.
Great, thank you. The next question is an anonymous one, or I don't see who submitted it, is how can we ensure communities won't suffer disproportionate impacts from implementing these technologies? And I'll see if Dr. Buck would like to address this one first or open it up to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point is to be in dialogue with communities about what their priorities and needs and concerns are. So there's a procedural approach to answering that question, making sure that communities are at the table, before a project's been proposed in the design stage, but both on the project level, but in terms of policies that are going to incentivize further projects like the low carbon fuel standard or others. So that might be like the first starting place. But it's not even enough if the public engagement is approached as kind of a tick box exercise, right? Because communities have a lot of experience with that style of engagement too. So I invite everyone and hope that we can do better this time around, because we have examples of either poor public engagement or no public engagement. We had the Hydrogen Energy California project more than 10 years ago that was proposed in Kern County that had a lot of criticism for really important reasons around, transportation, reducing air quality, things that might be released in the gasification process, et cetera. So hopefully we can draw on poor experiences and do better this time around.
Dr. Sant, I believe you have your hand raised. Would you like to expand?
Yes, I do. Yes, maybe one of the other things that we need to be considering when we think about communities as an example, just like everything else, there are finite risks we're taking on projects. And, some of these risks are really well categorized, some of them are not. As an example, while we've done CCS for several decades now, our ability to do this at a sufficient scale, to do, as an example, 450 million tons in a single state is basically unknown. This is something that we haven't done before. And so, I think there is really a need to be able to look at these risks in a lot more detail, but also to be able to address these risks. So as an example, there isn't really clear mechanisms to be able to address the liability that would be associated with projects. Some countries around the world are taking on this position that they essentially offer sovereign guarantee on sequestration projects. I don't think we've got that as an example in California. And I think, it's important that we think about approaches of this sort, because you want to be able to hold harmless in a circumstance where you're taking on projects that really fulfill a societal good. And so, I think the state as an example, and, maybe even as a nation, we have a role to play to really be able to step in and offer project developers the support that is needed to be able to take projects of the sort forward. I make this comment right now in the case of CCS, but I think this comment is generally true when we look at our entire portfolio of carbon management technologies, because you cannot get something for nothing. And there is a big question on really how we handle liability and risk that's associated with CCS.
Thank you. I'll turn to the next.
Could I just step in on the issue of low-income communities and disadvantaged communities? So in some cases, if you were to deploy CCS, it would actually be a big benefit. For example, in cement manufacturing, there are lots of air emissions associated with that. And if you want to capture the carbon, you actually have to eliminate all those criteria pollutant emissions before you can actually run it through the chemical process that will extract the CO2. Otherwise, all these other pollutants make the solvent ineffective. So for something like a cement plant where you install one of these facilities, it actually would be a big air quality benefit. That's not true for all the sources. In some cases, it's just sort of, a pass, it's just neutral, but for certain facilities, including refining facilities, you would get a big air quality benefit. Great,
you actually started to answer the question I was just about to ask that comes from Matthew Baker, Deputy Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency, which is, can you speak to what we know about emissions of criteria pollutants from carbon capture for industry and hydrogen production? So could you expand, Dr. Benson, going beyond cement and refineries?
Right. So for natural gas combined cycle, basically the emissions there are NOx emissions. And the carbon capture process is pretty insensitive to those NOx emissions. So basically those just carry through. So I think to first order, using today's most prevalent technology, this amine scrubbing technology, the emissions would be slightly more because it takes a certain amount of energy. It's not a lot more, it'd probably be like, I don't know, 10 or 15% more. But it wouldn't be a reduction. The places where you get the big benefits are when you have sulfur emissions are the ones that you need to take out before. And then with regard to hydrogen production, I don't have those numbers on the top of my head. I'm happy to track them down. I think it would be basically sort of neutral with regard to the role of carbon capture on the criteria pollutant emissions. Oh, let me say one other thing. There are new technologies that are coming along that completely eliminate all emissions, that it's like there's zero emission plants. And these are some of the new advanced technologies, like instead of basically having a gas turbine and then a steam cycle, you can actually run a whole power plant on carbon dioxide, supercritical carbon dioxide. And under those conditions, they require no water whatsoever. And literally the whole stream of emissions just gets pumped underground. There's no smokestack emissions. Those technologies aren't quite here yet today, but there's very significant development, and there's a 50 megawatt power plant pilot down in Texas that's a collaboration between a number of companies. So that'll be, if that comes along, that would be quite exciting because it's also very efficient.
Thank you. The next question I have is directed towards Dr. Buck. In your introduction, you mentioned you work in Kern County. Could you share more details about that work and any upcoming reports on it?
This was a project that Lawrence Livermore National Labs is leading. So obviously with the pandemic, I haven't been there to conduct research myself. There's been many video and telephone interviews with different stakeholders. They also did a survey of several hundred people, which combined give a picture of some of the things that people are most concerned about in the area. I mean, some key takeaways are that I think both in Kern County and the Delta, people are wary of outsiders coming in determining activities in their region. They're concerned about water. They have questions about why here, more so in the Delta. About less than 30% of people are familiar with these technologies, so most people haven't heard about them. There's some generally positive reactions when people hear for the first time, if this is part of California's climate goals, but with little intensity, meaning that people don't have a strong feeling, they still need to learn more about it. This isn't about particular environmental justice communities. This is a more representative general public study. And they want public input. They want new permanent jobs, not temporary ones, as well as strict protections for land, water, and wildlife. All of those are priorities. And also an important takeaway is that people don't view these projects as important per se. So, you know, climate scientists or others might think that these are really important projects to develop, but that importance isn't felt in the region. We could talk more about any of that.
Thank you. Next question comes from Anonymous. Can you please speak to the uncertainties associated with geological storage? What happens if there are leaks of CO2 from these storage sites? Maybe not from the site itself, but from improperly sealed wells, pipelines leading to those storage sites, etc. Perhaps I'll let Mr. Jordan address this question first.
Yeah, so there have been, well, for wells, the research has focused sort of on two different types of leakage. One is chronic, which is leakage that occurs essentially on an ongoing basis, but it's at such a low level that it's not immediately noticed and mitigated. And there's research on that, the prevalence of that, the magnitudes that it emits at. And then there's events like what happened in Aliso Canyon, where you have a well blowout. And while that's a very dramatic event, those kinds of events occur, say, 1 out of every 10,000 wells, or 1 out of every 100,000 wells per year. In the past, the Class 6 wells that are specified would not be operated and engineered like that well that blew out at Aliso Canyon. That well was operated and designed in a way that if there was a single failure, it would release the gas. And Class 6 wells are designed to a much more stringent standard than that. In terms of consequences, there are examples of CO2 blowouts in, say, Texas and the Gulf Coast. And they have occurred in relation to CO2 EOR projects. Again, they're not common, but they have caused evacuations, some of them. So it is something for society to think about. It's a relative risk proposition, the risk of this technology versus the risk of not using this technology. So again, that's a decision for policymakers. It's, again, to frame the risk, we're talking about 1 out of 10,000, 1 to 100,000 for wells, for those kinds of more dramatic blowouts. The chronic leakage doesn't really have any public health impact. Obviously, it impacts the security of storage, but that chronic leakage is not really a public health impact.
Yeah, maybe can I just say a little bit about that? So in California, we have regulations that require that if you have a storage reservoir and then you have the seal on top, and then California requires you to have a secondary unit that could also retain the CO2 if it leaked, that was salty and doesn't have any other beneficial use. And so if the CO2, to have one of these chronic leaks that Preston mentioned, for example, a leakage up a wellbore, what would happen is that if the CO2 plume migrated over to that wellbore, and that wellbore was actually open, the CO2 could migrate up. And the most likely thing that it would do is it would start to flow into that overlying aquifer, not really an aquifer, saline formation. And one of the most important things to do for a CO2 storage project is to have good monitoring. And one of the primary monitoring technologies is that you actually put a pressure sensor in that saline formation above your storage reservoir. And it turns out, even if you have very small leaks, that the pressure buildup caused by this leaking CO2 is fairly easily detectable, even for small values. And if you have more than one monitoring well, you can actually locate where it is. So the monitoring for these projects is really important. And this is not out of sight, out of mind. There's a multiplicity of monitoring technologies, and the pressure one is above the storage reservoir is particularly one that responds to the issue of leakage out of the storage reservoir, chronic leakage. Yeah, and then if you find it, then you can go in and if you have enough monitoring wells, you'll know where that is, and you could go basically figure out where your leak was and try to remedy that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from a former CEC commissioner, Jim Boyd. In the early 2000s, the CEC had an extensive portfolio of research activities in CCST, including drilling a pilot well in the Delta, creating a blue ribbon panel, and a national conference. This question is directed towards you, Dr. Benson. Do you know if there have been any updates to this work that was completed in the past, or how the information might be used today?
Sure, yeah, there's a lot of updates, and after I say something, we should have Preston talk about some of the work they've done. Yes, California did a lot of work, and it laid a foundation. For example, it identified where all the CO2 storage reservoirs were, in saline formations and in oil and gas reservoirs. So that provided a fantastic foundation. It did some drilling and got detailed lithology that was very helpful. There's been quite a bit of work since then. The U.S. Geological Survey did an independent assessment and basically came to quite similar conclusions to that earlier work that CEC was involved in. Lawrence Livermore has done a lot of work. Lawrence Berkeley has done a lot of work. Stanford just completed this new big assessment. So I would say from a research point of view, there's been a tremendous amount of momentum and new knowledge. I think what has been slower is getting projects off the ground, and why that may happen is sort of a different subject. But Preston, I know you've been heavily involved in the California work as well.
Yeah, thanks. So as I mentioned, there's been a lot of work that California Geological Survey did some more detailed level mapping of some primary reservoirs in the Sacramento Valley area that has been very helpful to take forward into siting projects. And there are some projects that have used that as input into their siting process. For Lawrence Berkeley Lab, we were involved in a project funded by the Department of Energy to look at siting projects in Kern County in the southern part of the San Joaquin Basin. And so we did a lot of work and extended a geologic model there in cooperation with Lawrence Livermore Lab, looking at the primary reservoirs that could provide sequestration there. So there's a good framework in terms of the understanding of geology, not really at a project specific level, but at a basin level to give us confidence that there's a lot of storage capacity. And there's been some work done on constraints of, population density, future planning for land use. I've looked at surface ownership fragmentation, for instance, to get at this question of where could you actually put a CO2 sequestration project where the footprint of the CO2 has fewer rather than more surface landowners. And I think that's really going to become, for this to go to scale, that's going to become a pretty substantial issue, because you quickly run out of the spots where you may only have 2 or 3 landowners because of fragmentation of ownership. So yeah, it's advanced. We know more about where the limitations are, where the sequestration opportunities are.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question and then maybe a minute each for closing remarks. So we'll finish off with this question from an anonymous person. Some have expressed concern that carbon sequestration will just extend the use of fossil fuels. Is there a way to ensure that carbon sequestration doesn't slow aggressive action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And I'll open that up to the panel.
I'm happy to try and offer a bit of a response. So the short answer is, I think taking a pragmatic view, I think keeping economics in mind. I think fossil fuels are going to be a part of our future for the next couple of decades in any event. But I don't think this is an either-or circumstance. What dictates economics is also going to dictate our solutions around carbon management, generally speaking. And the short answer is, while we've done a lot of work, there's still a lot of work needed to really get sequestration or any other carbon management solutions really to scale. Because while there is, I would say, some momentum in moving forward, the costs of carbon capture still need to come down by a lot for us to really do wide-scale, large-scale adoption, globally speaking. And so I don't think that, this is necessarily a true perspective that, just because we do carbon management, we're going to allow the propagation of fossil fuels. I think the market is really going to make these choices for us rather than anything else. I think it's being borne out really well as an example with the reduction in coal use as an example around the United States with renewable energy, and also around the world. And, I think this is something which we're going to see. And, I think this is where technology plays a really important role, because collapsing the cost of carbon management is really what is going to enable these technologies to come to scale. I don't think this is conditioned on necessarily the use of fossil fuels one way or another. It's simply based on how quickly can we take what we have technologically and bring it to scale.
Thank you. And I think I'll just close there and turn it over for each of you to have a minute. I'll start off with you, Dr. Benson, if you want to have some closing remarks.
Yeah, anyway, thank you very much. Those were really great questions. I guess from my perspective, I, like all of us, am deeply concerned that, time is passing. It's now 2021. We've globally done not nearly enough to reduce emissions. This is a technology that today, under certain circumstances, is cost competitive with other options. Single projects can, get you deep emissions cuts, 1 million tons at a time or so, or even bigger projects up to say a couple million tons. And, clearly, renewable energy is growing quickly. EVs are growing quickly. Battery costs are coming down. So there's so many great things happening, but there are certain sectors that we really don't have other good solutions for. And, I think it's time to dip our toe in the water and, figure out, is this going to work for us here in California? And if it does, then we can begin to think seriously about scaling.
Thank you. Dr. Buck, would you like to share some closing remarks?
Yeah, just to touch on this question about mitigation deterrence, which I think is a fundamental one. I think there's two things we need to do. We need to develop roadmaps for a managed decline of fossil fuels, not just in California or the US, but every country in the world would have to tackle this, and that's a climate justice issue. And you combine CCS and carbon removal technologies into those roadmaps, it has to be the same discussion. The other thing we need to do is separate carbon capture and storage for mitigation conceptually and carbon offsets, and that discussion with carbon dioxide removals. So CCS underpins both of those, but we have the capacity to remove legacy carbon in the atmosphere that's causing chaos, that's producing death, really. So, if we develop CCS, we have that use case for it. What does it say about us if we don't choose to do that? Lots of hard questions here.
Thank you. And Mr. Jordan, would you like to share some closing remarks?
Sure. I think picking up on what Sally said about the number of industrial sources that are hard to otherwise mitigate, for instance, cement manufacturing, and coming up with a number in the Stanford EFI, another institution study of say 45 million, 60 million tons a year. To put that in perspective for people involved in policy, that would be take an industry that is about the size of the oil industry in California, plus or minus. So to give you a feel for scale, I've also heard, and this is not my not my area of expertise at all, but I've heard that inland California, if it was its own state, would be one of the poorest, if not the poorest state in the country. And that is where a lot of oil and gas production occurs currently. So I think, as Holly said, there is an opportunity to do this right. There's an opportunity to do it wrong. And I've mentioned that California, didn't get a single molecule of CO2 in the ground for research. So it's not inevitable that we're going to be able to do this without policy support if the policymakers decide that this is the direction they want California to head.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Sant, if you would share your closing remarks.
Sure. Thanks very much, David. Really 3 comments that come to mind. I think there is no silver bullet in this business. We have to be focused on a portfolio of solutions. I think CCS is clearly going to be one of them, but there are going to be others, including carbon dioxide utilization and looking at approaches beyond classic geological sequestration. Number 2, I think we need to be really focused on de-risking and scaling technology. I think this is something that we're not doing enough of, and we need to be doing a lot more of, because technology needs to be de-risked and brought to scale. And finally, I think we really need to establish regulatory and legislative clarity around the fact that carbon dioxide is a problem and it has a price associated with it. Whether it's a tax or a human cost, choose either ways. But we need to place a number to it, because there is a need for regulatory clarity, really, for us to move forward in doing something about this.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for your participation as panelists, and I'll turn it over to Amber to close us out. Thank you. It was great.
Thank you, David. And I'd like to reiterate the thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists for sharing your time and expertise with us. Thank you to our CCST staff who make this all possible. And please visit our website. You can see a recording of this there, as well as other briefings that we provided. We'll also try to make available some of these resources that were shared by our panelists today. And we hope you have a lovely afternoon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.